Claims of discrimination and warnings of a growing sectarian rift. Is the Sunni-Shia divide about to explode wide open? Sunnis hold the majority in the region, but many fear a Shia awakening that could strip them of power. This is Inside Story. Hello there, welcome to the programme. I'm Shuli Ghosh. Well, this week, two Shiite activists in the Gulf states have been stripped of their citizenships, sparking claims of discrimination and pointing to growing tensions between Sunni and Shia. Kuwaiti activist Yassir al Habib was accused of abusing religious symbols and trying to cause a sectarian rift. He'd made disparaging remarks about the Prophet Muhammad's wife. So worried is the Kuwaiti government of the possibility of violence has banned all public gatherings to try to contain the tensions. Meanwhile, in Bahrain, Ayatollah Hussein Mirza Najati was stripped of his passport on Sunday in a clampdown on Shia activists ahead of next month's parliamentary elections. Bahrain has seen a wave of clashes and street protests by Shiites who form the majority of the population, but say they face discrimination in state jobs and housing. Well, Sunnis and Shias are, of course, both branches of Islam. Some argue that the differences between the two sides will come increasingly to the fore, determining regional alliances and political attitudes. Let's take a quick look at the distribution of the two major Islamic sects in the Middle East. The majority of people in Bahrain are Shia, even though the government is Sunni. They make up almost 2/3 of the population. Shia also make up the majority in Lebanon, Iraq and Iran. But across the rest of the region, the Sunnis are dominant. In Syria, the population is mainly Sunni, even though the ruling elite are claimed to be Shia. And all the Gulf countries, except for Bahrain, of course, are Sunni-dominated with Shia minorities. In all, some 90% of the world's Muslims are Sunni. But some scholars are warning of a Shia revival in the region, fuelled by the American invasion of Iraq. There, a Sunni regime was toppled to make way for the Shia majority. And the spectre of a rising Shia influence is worrying the Gulf states, where much of the region's power and wealth is concentrated in Sunni hands. So let's discuss the issues with my guests today. In Beirut, we have Faleh Abdel-Jabbar. He's the director of the Iraqi Institute for Strategic Studies. In London, Mehdi Hassan, senior political editor of The New Statesman, a weekly current affairs and politics magazine. And also in London, Azam Tamimi, director of the Institute of Islamic Political Thought. Gentlemen, welcome to all of you. I should point out at the outset that I am not a Muslim, so I'm coming at this from an outside perspective. But it does seem that one of the main problems for Shias in the Arab world is one of marginalisation. Faleh, would you agree with that they feel marginalised whether they're the majority or the minority of the population?
Indeed, I mean, there is this element, definitely. You know, sectarianism is, in its positive side, and this is, you know, a paradoxical expression, but nevertheless a true one. It's a signal that there is, you know, something wrong in the system. Just like you're having temperature in your body, or having inflation, or the bank system collapses, you know, it gives you a signal that the system is in trouble, that there is something wrong. And what's this something wrong? Why is it, why sectarianism arises after so many, you know, more than half a century of nation building processes, after so many efforts of, you know, modernization, inception of the rule of law, so to speak, or the inception of the principle of citizenship, which
but has there not been differences of opinion and conflict between Shia and Sunni for centuries, ever since they both diverged?
Well, absolutely. I mean, this sectarian divide, the Shia-Sunni divide, is more than 4 centuries old. What happened during the last decades, 2 decades, or 3 decades, in fact, is the politicization of these differences. And from there, even we have a militarization of these differences, as we have seen in the Lebanon, in Iraq, and indeed in Yemen. So why this politicization? Why at this point? We have at least 3 clusters of factors. One is the failure of distribution, fair distribution of power and resources. And since most of these countries are either rentier states, meaning they have oil revenues, external revenues, external as far as society is concerned. So the distribution of power is also a distribution of wealth. And any disequilibrium in this distribution would generate grievances, and grievances would tend to be politicized. This is one. But number two, which is very important, is the decline of ideological politics. And I mean by that Arab nationalism and Marxism, which covered the horizon really during the 50s and 60s. This decline gave rise to a political Islam, which is sectarian by definition, even if it is dormant in this or that case. And the third signal, the third factor is the rise of Islamic revolution in Iran, which changed the political culture in the whole region, across the region. And we have this shift, strong shift towards Islamization of politics, Islamization of culture, Islamization of
Okay,
this
let me
and
bring Mehdi
So-
in there because
Sure.
that is one of the things that seems to be a factor here. Not so much religious differences, perhaps, but geopolitical factors and perhaps a fear over Iran and Iran's intentions?
I think it is a lot to do with geopolitics, Shuli. As you said, this divide has been going on for 14 centuries since the Prophet's death in 632 AD. There's no real reason why it should rear its head now more than in previous decades or centuries, other than the political situation of the Middle East in particular at the moment. And you look at the Iraq War, which you mentioned in the introduction. You have the invasion of Iraq, which put one of the biggest Arab countries, one of the most important Arab countries, the governance of that country into the hands of the Shia majority, which had been repressed by a Sunni elite led by Baathists, led by Saddam Hussein for decades. And that upset a lot of vested interests in the region. And it was also exacerbated by an American occupying force that played off different factions against one another. They lined up, the Americans under Paul Bremer set up Iraqi elections on the basis of Shia, Sunni, Kurd, etc., which led more to those divisions. Let's not also forget, though, we can't just all blame it on the Americans, much as we like to. There's also an issue of Al-Qaeda, which is kind of the elephant in the room. We have an ideology of takfirism, jihadism, whatever you want to call it, which sees not only Americans and Jews as the enemy, but also Shias as the enemy. We saw bomb blasts in Pakistan a couple of weeks ago, which killed hundreds of innocent Shias, and which the Taliban and the Al-Qaeda groups who carried it out said, well, it's because the Shias are our enemy as much as the Americans are. So it's a double whammy of kind of internal and external enemies exacerbating these age-old theological divides.
OK, let's have a look at this. The fear of a rising Shia influence across the region was encapsulated by King Abdullah of Jordan back in 2004, when he said if pro-Iran parties or politicians dominate the new Iraqi government, a new crescent of dominant Shia movements or governments stretching from Iran into Iraq, Syria and Lebanon could emerge. Azam, I know that King Abdullah had to slightly backpedal from that because it was seen as insulting for Shias. But that fear, is that what is prevailing in the region at the moment?
Well, it does exist within many circles, but I think the statement by King Abdullah at the time had very much to do with the potential switch in policy by the United States of America, which felt after the invasion of Iraq that Iraq was being taken over by the Iranians, and that the Iranians ended up having more influence on Iraq or in Iraq than the Americans themselves. But of course, the concern does exist. It exists in Iraq, in Bahrain, in neighboring countries, in Saudi Arabia, elsewhere in the region. But it is mostly generated by the political crisis. And if you remember, when the Iranian Revolution happened a long time ago in 1979, the Americans played the Sunni card by sending Saddam Hussein across the border to subdue the revolution. And Saddam Hussein, prior to that, wasn't a representative of the Sunnis, and he oppressed equally the Sunnis and the Shiites, and it wasn't really a Sunni regime.
Well, this was a big miscalculation for the Americans, wasn't it? Because they were supporting Saddam Hussein, and then when they came to remove him, they suddenly had this vacuum in which the Shias have now gained more influence.
Iraq was a similar
when they wanted to remove Saddam Hussein, they decided to play the Shia card. And they brought all these Shiites who were with us here in London and elsewhere in Europe and America as refugees, brought them and installed them in power, hoping that they do the job for them. So actually foreign intervention plays a major role in the current crisis.
Mehdi, do you agree with that? That Iraq is now, the whole situation in Iraq is exacerbating the issue?
I think Azam is right. There's a foreign intervention is key to understanding this debate as well, because, for example, the British Empire was based on divide and rule. There's no reason why the American Empire can't use the same tactics, and we've seen that in Iraq. But the miscalculation in Iraq was that they installed all these Iraqi Shias, refugees, as Azam puts it, in power, not realizing, such is the ignorance of the US government towards Islam and the internal divisions and splits in Islam, that actually people like Ibrahim Jafari and people like Maliki, the former Prime Minister, the current Prime Minister, etc., were people who actually owe a lot of their allegiances to Iran. So Iran has actually been emboldened by the American invasion of Iraq. Iran's actually much more influential, a much bigger player in the modern Middle East because of the American invasion of Iraq. And one key point, Shuli, when we talk about Arab governments or when we talk about Gulf states, we are talking about the regimes, the governments, which are unelected, not necessarily reflecting the people. I don't think the average Arab on the street in Cairo or in Damascus or in Riyadh is that worried about Iran. I think they are still much more worried about America or Israel or Britain or whatever it is. And you saw in 2006 in the Lebanon war, Arab governments tried to back Israel at the beginning because Israel was taking on Shia Hezbollah, but they had to switch their position because the Arab streets started naming all their kids Hassan Nasrallah and started holding "We're with Hezbollah" placards. So you have to be careful about confusing the Arab governments with the so-called Arab street.
Absolutely, I take your point. And just to add to that, wasn't the joke at the time of the invasion that a lot of the Americans didn't know the difference between the Sunnis and Shias, particularly in the intelligence community. They didn't even know whether Al-Qaeda was Sunni or Shia.
Exactly. There was a very revealing report at the time in Congressional Quarterly which showed that leading members of the intelligence community on Capitol Hill and in the FBI weren't sure whether Hezbollah was Sunni or Shia or Al-Qaeda was Sunni or Shia. So yeah, it exacerbates all these problems that have been around for 1400 years.
Fallow, what do you say to those who worry that, for example, in Iraq now, we've seen this political upheaval. We have seen an alliance between the Shia State of Law Coalition, the Shia Iraqi National Alliance, the fear that Iraq has basically been handed over to Iran.
Well, let me disagree with some of the points. I agree with most of the points that were mentioned earlier by my colleagues in this meeting. First, I mean, the Americans did not empower Shias. They allowed the empowerment of Shia Islamists. There is a big difference between Shias and Shia Islamists. We are talking here about an ideological strand. This ideological strand emerged as a result of the shift from ideological politics that overwhelmed the 50s, 60s, and to some extent to the end of the 70s. But now we have identity politics instead because of, as I said, the decline of Marxism, socialist movements, and nationalist movements. Jamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt and Saddam Hussein in 1991 in Iraq. So this decline created a vacuum. And the Americans actually relied heavily on Shia liberals like Ahmed Chalabi and Shia liberal nationalists like Iyad Alawi, but they couldn't, simply because the identity politics of the Shia as a sectarian concept gained mass approval and was embraced by the people inside the country. And to say that empowering Shias full stop is a total mistake, simply because, as I said, there are.
But what about the effects on the rest of the region? I mean, this has been said.
Hang on a minute.
Go, continue.
Yeah. I mean, we need to talk, in specific terms. Neither the Shias are a monolithic bloc. Some of Shia strands opposed American invasion, like the Sadrists. And look at the dilemma now in Iraq. We have three Shia blocs, unable to hammer out an agreement, which means that they have different political agendas and they have different attitudes towards Iran. And Iran does not, failed to create a pan-Shia bloc thus far. It may succeed in the future, I don't know, but thus far it has failed miserably. So the Americans did. I mean, Iraqi political actors are growing more and more autonomous, not to the point that they are fully autonomous, but to some extent they are.
Go on, Mehdi, what are you saying?
I was just going to say, while I respect that opinion, and it's a very cogent position, unfortunately, that's a very academic way of looking at it. That's, you know, where we look at it in terms of our kind of informed distinctions between this bloc, this Islamist, that non-Islamist. When the average Iraqi refugee gets into a cab in Amman, Jordan, and the cab driver says to him, "Are you Shia or Sunni?" He's not asking if you're a Shia Islamist or a non-Shia Islamist. The problem is, on the, you know, across on the streets, in the towns and cities across the Middle East, we now are having this split, which is a very monolithic split, which is where Sunnis are grouping together and fearing Shias, and vice versa. The Shias are saying, well, they're all out to kill us and therefore we should all back Iran. And there is, unfortunately, that tribal sense which tends to override all these finer political and theological and ideological distinctions. And that's what worries me. I've never, you know, you look at history, and I can't see a time, certainly in the last 100 years, where the sectarian divide was not as pronounced and not as extreme as it is now post-Iraq.
Azam, do you agree with that? And do you think enough efforts are being made to try and bridge this gap?
I think some people have been making efforts to bridge the gap, but someone like Yassir al Habib and some of the crazy guys around, with very little effort, destroy years of work by people who try to bring the two sides together, and who are trying to tell people, let history lie alone, and let's work about today and the future.
Azam, I know that you know. Can I just ask, Azam? I know that you know Yassir al Habib, who was the Kuwaiti who was stripped of his citizenship because of his remarks. I mean, do you think that kind of reaction is a taste of things to come? Then, perhaps.
I think someone like Yassir al Habib exploits the current climate, which is created by politics mainly. And he creates a climate where we see tension in Bahrain, where we see tension in Iraq and in other places, in Lebanon as well. And the danger of what Yassir al Habib says is that he claims to present the fundamental Shi'i position vis-a-vis history and Islam. In this regard, we see people in Bahrain polarized as a result. Sunnis on one side, Shi'is on one side. The eastern province of Saudi Arabia, in much of Iraq, in some parts of Lebanon. This is a very serious divide, by the way.
And are you seeing a momentum beginning there? Sorry, Mehdi, you wanted to respond to that.
I mean, this is let's be real here. Yassir Habib, I don't know the man. I'm a Shia. I don't agree with his rhetoric. But let's be very realistic here. He is an irrelevance on a global scale. The fact that the Bahraini parliament decided to strip him of citizenship to make a show of a point that there's elections coming up and they're threatened by their Shia majority. It was a Kuwaiti government,
but yeah, the same thing happened in Bahrain.
Sorry, the Kuwaiti government, the same thing happened in Bahrain.
But I think what I'm trying to get at is there a momentum going here of which those are symptoms?
But I can't take these points seriously about two random preachers when Shias are being blown up in Pakistan and you don't hear any kind of condemnation from those same parliaments in Bahrain and Kuwait. So I have a real problem when people are actually being blown up on the streets of Lahore in Pakistan for being Shia, and the Taliban are saying this is because we believe the Shias are as worse enemies as Americans. I think it's a real a mistake to focus on some kind of fringe preachers.
But in terms of the Middle East and the Gulf, where it has already been pointed out that, you know, mainly the Sunni regimes are the ones who control the wealth, the oil production, the political power,
and are undemocratic.
Are those days numbered? I mean, is that what these regimes are worried about?
I suspect they are. I suspect, especially regimes like Bahrain, where there is a majority Shia population and the government is totally unrepresentative, I suspect they look at Iraq. The great fear of Iraq was, here was Iraq, where the Shias had been kept down. It was the biggest Shia majority country, a very, very important country in the Middle East, politically, culturally, religiously. And you had actually here a Sunni dictator removed and Shias actually empowered. Whether they're Shia Islamists or non-Shia Islamists, that's fine. I take Fallah's point. But that has worried a lot of these decrepit dictators in a lot of corners of the very undemocratic Gulf region.
Do you think that the US and the West is perhaps worried at the potential of instability in countries like Saudi Arabia, who are their allies, because of Shia opinion?
I mean, I think if America is worried about its allies in the Middle East, countries like Saudi Arabia and Egypt, which are undemocratic dictatorships, I think they should be very careful about an Israeli or an American attack on Iran. Because if tomorrow, God forbid, there is a war in the Middle East in which America and or Israel attacks Iran, and these Sunni Arab dictatorships decide to back that attack because they see as an Iran as a threat to them, you will see turmoil on their own streets because their populations will not be with them. All the polling shows that actually the Arab street doesn't support any attack on Iran and actually sees Iran as standing up to the West, which they prefer to dislike.
OK, let me throw one more other thought into the mix. Vali Nasser is a professor of Middle East and South Asian politics and wrote the book The Shia Revival. Now, in it, he says Shias have welcomed both the fall of Sunni domination and the rise of prospects for political change. This makes them, in principle, more likely to work with the United States. Greater democracy serves Shia interests across the region, and hence Shia Revival is favourably disposed towards democratic change. Azam, do you agree with that?
Well, I think if there is a change of regime tomorrow anywhere in the region where Shiites might take over, there is no guarantee that the regime will be more democratic than the existing ones. Because there is polarization at the popular level. I've just recently been to Bahrain, and the Sunnis in Bahrain are fully backing the regime against what they believe and attempt to undermine their very existence. And therefore, it's no longer a question of a struggle of democracy against dictatorship. Yes, it was at one stage, and we'll of course all be supporting democratization and political reform. But when a threat is perceived by a substantial substantial ratio of the population, it becomes something else. It becomes
well, it's
either
not just a
I
substantial
or you,
ratio. I mean, they're
them.
the majority in Bahrain. The Shias make up the majority. So they are effectively being ruled by a minority. How long can that situation continue?
Well, the government anywhere in the world is a minority government, but that's not the issue. Even if the Sunnis in Bahrain are 40% or even 30%, this is still a substantial majority. And I think the King of Bahrain over the past 10 years or so did try to open up and introduce reforms. But I think there are people in Bahrain who want a radical change, who want to topple the regime, who believe that the Sunnah of Bahrain are occupiers, are colonizers. And you see this in their rhetoric, regrettably.
Fala, who gains from these divisions? Does anyone gain?
What do you mean by Sunni divisions?
These divisions, who is, when we see these kind of sectarian divides playing out, when we see Sunni pitted against Shia, who gains? Is it Israel? Is it enemy states?
Nobody gains. I mean, everybody loses in a sense, because simply we need to go beyond the so-called sacred empire. Most of the countries in the region were born out of the Ottoman Empire. And in that empire, we were half Bedouins, half rurals, and a small, insignificant minority living in towns that were divided by religious lines, by religious fracture lines, and sectarian and communal and other dividing lines. And now, you know, to create this new society, you need equitable inclusion, political inclusion, economic participation, if you like, cultural participation. Most of the Shias, for example, the demands began to have some cultural rights, meaning to have their rituals, to do their rituals, to have the call for prayers to be said in the Sunni version and in the Shia version. These were simple cultural demands, and they were politicized because there was cultural violation.
Okay, we're running out of time. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but let me just bring in Mekti for one last word.
No, I just want to say one point. The point raised by my colleague that on the mass level we have this strong and deep and profound sectarian feelings. This might be true, which is not totally true, but it might be true to a great extent. We need to take the political actors on the one hand and the public opinion on the other, and the interaction between the two. And this is not an academic gymnastics. This is the real analysis, relying on surveys, on questionnaire or interviews, and text analysis, not to, just to contrive something while we're sitting on an armchair.
Okay, Falak, we're going to have to leave it there. Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for taking part in a fascinating discussion. My guests today, Mehdi Hassan, Falak Abdel-Jabbar and Azam Tamimi. And thank you for watching. If you do have any comments, do email us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. But for the moment, from me, Shia-Sunni, see you next time.